Hey everyone, welcome to Formidable Opponents, a show that pits three people who have known each other virtually their entire lives in a series of conversations as we argue what is best in a variety of fun, engaging, and critical topics we all debate about. So as you know, we're celebrating Wrestlemania, so today's topic is Best Professional Wrestler, Episode 9. We decided to change it up a little bit, call an audible. We had a different topic going into this week, but we decided we wanted to talk a little wrestling tonight. Today, I'm joined by Cousin Luke and Cousin Butch, the Bushwhackers, otherwise known as Bob and Joseph. Try not to lick each other's face, guys. And of course, I'm Randall, and we're going to talk a lot about wrestling, what defines a great wrestler. We're going to argue who the best wrestler is, and we're going to have a lot of fun tonight. So, guys, welcome today. How are you guys doing?
Doing pretty good. Excited about Wrestlemania. I'm going to check it out a little bit later. I saw some clips online on Twitter, but trying not to know what too much is going on so I can check that out later. Gonna be a late night.
I've always thought of myself as more of a hacksaw Jim Duggan kind of guy, rather than the Bushwhacker. So I'm a little
and I was a headbanger. You should have called that out. You could either call me Mosh or Crash.
I mean, we both played football. You could have said that we were the Road Warriors with the fucking spiky shoulder pads. You had to go with that.
So, guys, this is a topic obviously very near and dear to us. We grew up as wrestling fans. We're going to share a little bit of our wrestling history. I'll talk a little bit about mine. Started watching wrestling at a very young age. I used to submit letters, to Pro Wrestling Illustrated as a young child. I'll actually post some of those on our social media. I was also a contributing writer for a website called Scoop Central in the late 90s. I loved watching wrestling as a kid. I remember the 80s boom. I remember watching all these wonderful NWA affiliates, Georgia Championship Wrestling with Tommy Rich and Buzz Sawyer. One of my personal favorites is World Class Championship Wrestling with the Von Erichs, Freebirds, the dynamic duo Gino Hernandez and Chris Adams. The one thing about World Class Championship Wrestling, they really revolutionized music, coming out to rock music, camera angles. They had actual cameramen on the apron, very close and everything, different camera styles. Southwest Championship Wrestling, which played a lot. They were on the USA Network before they couldn't pay the bills anymore, and they were overtaken by the WWF with Scott Casey and Adrian Street. Southwest Championship Wrestling. Mid-South with Hacksaw Duggan, Ted DiBiase, Dr. Death Steve Williams. Later on, watching the AWA on ESPN with Scott Hall, Kurt Hennig, Nick Bockwinkel. I didn't get to watch a lot of the other territorial wrestling federations like Continental with Jerry Jarrett, Jerry Lawler, Jeff Jarrett. Jerry Jarrett was the owner, who's Jeff Jarrett's father. And of course, that's the federation where Andy Kaufman did his whole stunt with Jerry Lawler. So everybody remembers Continental in Memphis from that incident. At its apex, there was 20 plus territories in the National Wrestling Alliance. Owners agreed not to steal talent. Of course, that's before Vince McMahon decided to split from the NWA and decided to do his own thing, which we all know was really successful for him. It was all regional, with some affiliates getting cable rights. I mentioned Southwest Championship Wrestling using the USA Network and Georgia Championship Wrestling using TBS. A lot of storylines were shared. They had a traveling champion. I heard Brian Koppelman, who's the creator of the show Billions, was planning on doing a documentary on the territory days. And then, of course, the WWF, which I started watching in 1984. I actually remember the first match I watched in the WWF. It was Magnificent Morocco against Ricky Steamboat in a gi match to whoever, submitted the other one or took off the other's gi first. I can't remember, but they expanded nationally, became labeled as sports entertainment. They were crossing over with musicians, bringing in Cyndi Lauper for the rock and wrestling connections, actors, movies, cartoons, big rubber action figures that you could actually concuss people with. And they catered to children. Vince McMahon truly realized that kids had as much purchasing power as their parents. Of course, there were some business ventures that weren't as successful. The XFL comes to mind, although they're having another reboot with The Rock. Films, the Ico Pro, the bodybuilding failures, etc. Of course, the steroid trials happened. I stopped watching in 92 when the WWF had their new generation come in. And the reason I stopped watching it is because girls weren't watching wrestling. I was a high school kid that wanted to date girls, and I wanted a Valentine other than Greg the Hammer Valentine. So I decided to take a little break.
Beautiful hair.
Yes, he did.
My funny Valentine.
And 96 brought me back with the NWO and, of course, the Monday Night Wars, Mr. McMahon, The Rock, and all these other wonderful things. But guys, tell me a little bit about your wrestling memories and you as a wrestling fan growing up.
I think of, there's a lot of nostalgia when it comes to wrestling. And growing up, I was a big fan, just like you were. I actually remember a funny or watching a lot of the Royal Rumbles and wrestling pay-per-views at your house with your dad and your brother, or we'd watch them in my house. I love those. Those are some of the best memories. Sunday nights, eating a sandwich or ordering pizza with very little sauce, right? Watching these Royal Rumbles and these wrestling events. I was a huge fan of wrestling in the late 80s and all throughout the 90s. That golden era, we got to see a little bit of it. And then the Attitude Era, of course, I was still all in on that. One of the best memories I have was actually when I was 11 years old, my dad actually surprised me with 4 tickets to go see WWF wrestling at South Padre Island. And I was like so ecstatic. And of course I was like, well, yeah, we're going to have a ticket for me and for you, Dad, and for Randy and for Mike and Filipino and we have our little group and we're going. And when I got there, when we're leaving, we had a Suburban. I was like, why the fuck are we in a Suburban? And my grandpa was there and this Uncle Ray and this uncle and this uncle. This, like, we got there and it ended up being hilarious because it would end up being like me, you, and me, you, my grandpa and Mike, and the kids were there and all the uncles went out drinking and partying and they picked us up afterwards.
I think they took Razor Ramon with them.
Which is great. I mean, that was one of my best memories because I remember it was like the golden era of like the Undertaker, Bret Hart versus Owen Hart feud, Shawn Michaels was there. Like there was a lot of great wrestlers and great. It was so nostalgic and awesome. And one of my best memories actually was going through shit at my parents' house the other day, and I found the old ticket, and I'm like, man, I need to frame that. It's really, really awesome. Yeah, for sure. What about you, Joe? Any great memories?
About real quick, wrestling? wasn't Bret? Didn't Bret Hart give you his sunglasses or Bushwhacker? Bushwhacker licked you. Something happened, right?
I left with Bret Hart's glasses, but I think it's because I let a wrestler lick me. I'm not too sure. My memory's pretty bad.
Now you don't need the COVID shot. You're totally exempt from that. Your immune system after the Bushwhackers licked you is totally uncompromised now. But Joseph, go ahead. Some of your memories.
Some of my earliest memories of wrestling were the early days of Hulk Hogan, Macho Man Randy Savage, The Ultimate Warrior, Papa Shango. Not so much Nature Boy Ric Flair, but the old Lex Luger. I remember I didn't have like cable at the time when I was younger, and I think every now and then they maybe did a show. Was it Sunday morning or Saturday morning? I'm not sure. I don't remember what it was, and I was able to catch that, so I was able to see some. And then later on, getting into it with the Attitude Era, probably the best era in professional wrestling on both sides, I guess. WCW and WWF, the whole war between them, that's great stuff. And then like we've all mentioned, this is something that when we're all friends, we've been friends. When you say virtually, what is it you say in the beginning? I'm sorry. Virtually our whole lives. Yes. Virtually our entire lives. Not virtually like how we're doing this because of the current situation with them. I mean, we mean like literally virtually, since we were kids, going over to Bob's house and watching a pay-per-view, or going over to your house, Randy, watching pay-per-view with you and Mike, your brother, and the Royal Rumble or Wrestlemania. We used to, picking numbers for the Rumble. That's always a great time. The winner getting $5.
It always sucked when the Red Rooster came off and we were like, shit, I know I'm not going to
win. But one of my, what's great is one of my first live professional wrestling live show was when they came down to Hidalgo. Us three and your brother Mike got to go see this show, and it was an awesome time. It was a great time. It was my first experience seeing them live with you guys, and you guys going to go see a live show, which kind of comes full circle. One of the best funny memories I have of that too is later when we went to go eat. After the show, we went to a local Outback Steakhouse, Logan's, yes. Right next to where the show is being had. Shout out to Logan's. And if you don't know us, I mean, great rolls. We're all pretty tall. We're all pretty much tall guys. About 6'1". Bob.
Why you got to say that? I'm the short one. So, I'm just gonna throw it out there. One of us is 6'6", the other one's 6'2". Yeah, Joe's is 6 foot, and I'm the midget.
I'm 6'1", sir.
I'm 6'3".
You're 6. Okay, according to Texas Tech, you're 5'11", sir. So let's go with 6 foot.
So we got 3 guys above 6 feet. The one being the biggest, Randy's brother, about what 6'4". What's Mike? 6'6". Yeah, 6'6". Yeah, we walk into Logan's, and apparently the wrestlers are are there eating too after the show, and we get confused for, hey, oh, you guys can go sit over here at this closed area, which was the bar area. We're like, okay, thanks. We just wanted to eat. We walked by. I think it was Edge and Christian.
Yeah.
And I forgot who else was sitting there. Maybe it was Randy Orton. I'm not sure. The Hurricane.
Unfortunately, Benoit was there too, but we won't go into that.
Yeah, we won't go into that. These guys are sitting there. And then later the manager, he comes and like, hey, I'm the manager. How you guys doing? Anything you need? And we're like, I think they think Mike's a wrestler, and maybe that's why we're allowed to eat here. Great time.
He did. I think he looked at Bob and said, hey, I love you on the Brother Love show. And I don't know where he got that from.
King of Queens would have worked. King of Queens would have worked. That's all right.
But the great memories, Joseph. I remember there was another event that we went to in Hidalgo, and I got to take a picture with John Cena. And it was back before we had cell phone cameras. We were doing the disposable cameras, and you're having a little trouble taking the photo. And I was like, take the picture, because John Cena looks impatient. And I just came out really bad in the photo. I'll post that on social media too, on our social media page.
Honestly, it was probably like 3 seconds, but those 3 seconds felt like fucking 20.
It did. It felt. And by the way, I'll make sure to tag myself so you guys don't get us mixed up on the photo. But so we're going to talk a little bit about our honorable mentions and who we didn't select, but really respect, really loved watching growing up. Joseph, tell us a little bit about some of your honorable mentions.
So I really enjoyed watching Macho Man Randy Savage, obviously Hulk Hogan. I mean, come on, when that entrance song would come on, people lose their shit. Hulkamania was huge. Really, obviously, I mean, The Undertaker, how can you not mention him? I know we didn't, or didn't pick him, but I mean, The Undertaker, Razor Ramon, Diesel, Shelton Benjamin, the Hardy Boys, Edge and Christian. I mean, so many. I was a big fan of Papa Shango. I loved that dude. He was creeping people out. That weird.
He ruined the Ultimate Warrior's career. So he ruined the Ultimate Warrior's.
He made him bleed. He terrible.
China, as tragic as that story is, she did some crazy, awesome things for women's wrestling. Trish Stratus, but China, plenty of women wrestling, and women wrestling. The women in WWE and WWE, because there's ACW and all that other ones too, but it's so huge. That roster is so much more than what it used to be. But China was just doing awesome. She was fighting dudes, and she was kicking their ass, and she was a great performer as well. Bob, how about you?
Great points.
You talk about wrestling, you get some amount of mentions. Definitely Macho Man Randy Savage. Ooh yeah, The Rock, which and then I mentioned The Rock, and I think it's perfect because he's really one of the main reasons that we started talking about wrestling again, because his show Young Rock is on I forget what channel it's on, NBC. I mean, it's brought back so much more, so much nostalgia, wrestling nostalgia, and growing up, and it's just such a great show. The Rock is definitely one of the best ever to do it. Bret Hart, I mean, the best there is, the best there was, the best ever will be, the most technical wrestler ever, right? Shawn Michaels, who's probably the smallest out of everybody, who probably had the most talent out of everybody on our list. Great wrestler and showman.
Triple H.
Triple H, and Triple H's okay. I mean, one of the ones I really want to talk about, who I wanted to pick, who I didn't end up going with, but I honestly feel he's probably the most underrated wrestler of all time, is Mick Foley. Mick Foley and his different personas. Of course, he was Cactus Jack, and he was Mankind. I feel like he brought so much to the table. I mean, he didn't really look the part. I mean, he wasn't this, built statuesque, looked like a goddamn, superhero, but he put his body on the line, his bones on the line, his career on the line to put on a great show. I mean, goddamn, he let The Undertaker throw him off a 30-foot cage. He got slammed through that 30-foot cage again onto tacks. He's broken through tables, let himself get hit in the face 20 times with a goddamn steel chair. This guy is just a barbed wire, ropes, and the crazy shit he did with Terry Funk. This guy was just amazing, and everything he did for the company, putting himself and his career on the line, I think it's so underrated, and he should be mentioned as one of the best ever.
Great mentions, guys. I have a few. Before I do mention my honorable mentions, I want to give a shout out to a couple of my friends who listen, who are huge wrestling fans. Alex Garcia, who loves Michael P.S. Hayes. Michael P.S. Hayes was a wrestler in the 80s.
My favorite.
He was the leader of the Freebirds. He was one of those guys who thought he was sexy, but he was not very attractive, but he was great on the mic. And also Joe Michael Vasquez, who loved the tag team of Chuck and Billy. He loved that gimmick. He also loved the Brooklyn Brawler. So I'm going to go to my honorable mentions. Eddie Guerrero, who I thought was amazing. Another tragic story, of course, but Eddie towards the end of, towards the early 2000s, wonderful run in the WWE, great comeback story, especially with all the adversity he faced with his personal demons, taken from us way too early. The Rock was incredible. His put downs were amazing. And shout out to you, Bob, for mentioning the TV show, because the guy that plays his father, Soulman Rocky Johnson, I mean, unbelievable.
Oh my God,
just like him.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Everybody they cast in the show is just perfect.
They did some really good stuff, man.
Yeah.
The Sheiky baby. I mean, come on, dude. I mean,
they cast some amazing talents there. John Cena is a guy that a lot of people sort of crap on, but I think John Cena really kept the WWE relevant. He was their stalwart, their flagship in the early 2000s. Andre the Giant, who was like a myth, a legend. Love watching him. Kurt Hennig during his Mr. Perfect days. And I love the vignettes. And Bob, you and I share the one vignette that we love a lot. Tell us a little bit about the Mr. Perfect vignette that we love watching.
I mean, the best one. The best one ever. I mean, he had a lot of great ones, but the best one ever, I forgot who he's talking to on a football field. He's like, "You want to see something perfect? Watch this." And he chunks the ball in the air, the football, and he runs like 100 yards down the field and catches it in the other end zone. It's just fucking perfect and over the top. And I loved Kurt Hennig. I think that's a great pick. Somebody I didn't mention, but he's a great wrestler.
What also makes that one so much funnier is that after he throws it, like you said, I don't know who it is, but he looks at him like, "Watch this," and then he takes off running. He has time to stop and like, "Oh, check this out." After I already threw the ball.
The thing is, like, he was so good because he did like the bowling, the basketball, and he had good forms with his bowling and his basketball. And the rumor was that he would, when they would film those things, he would always be missing. He'd be missing the shots. He'd be missing the strikes. But once they rolled tape, that's when he just started nailing it. But when you look at the football one, he looks like he throws about a 20-yard slant. But then when they cut to the roof of the building, it's like, because they're in a practice dome and they're playing his music. It's very passionate and very dramatic. And the ball is like a spiral that looks like Drew Brees and threw it something.
Troy Aikman, sir. We don't. You want to talk about a perfect spiral? You say Troy Aikman.
What's even better about Mr. Perfect, besides all those great promos and how great he was on the mic, Bret Hart called him probably the best wrestler that he ever wrestled.
Tremendous athlete.
And that's probably like the highest compliment you can get. Another athlete taken tragically early.
Yeah, I love Kurt Hennig. Dusty Rhodes was another one. Just a common man. The
man can dream death the road.
He does. The man can dream death the road. Let me tell you something here, Rick Flash.
with the polka dots. I love that shit.
I fucking love his theme, dude. I'll fucking walk around with that shit.
He, as I mentioned to you guys before, he looks like my dad looks like a Latino version of Dusty Rhodes, and I think that's why he's very endearing. But Dusty Rhodes didn't care. He went out there looking as big as he was, and he would put on great matches, great promos. His Hard Times promo, one of the best. Look it up on YouTube. Roddy Piper was another one I enjoyed. Very crazy in the 80s. Chris Jericho, who's still doing it in AEW. Love watching him. Ricky Steamboat, who I think is very underrated. One of the best WrestleMania matches with Macho Man in WrestleMania 3. Ricky Steamboat I mean, he was just incredibly talented.
I think Ricky Steamboat's biggest downfall was that he sucked on the mic. He wasn't as well rounded. He could wrestle anybody, anywhere, anytime, but his mic skills were he just didn't have that one talent.
Very, very good point. And he was always very serious on the mic. Undertaker, as I think Joseph, you mentioned, I have a funny Undertaker story. So in 1990, Mark Calloway, who wrestled as The Undertaker, became The Undertaker in November of 1990 when he debuted at Survivor Series. A few months before that, he was wrestling in WCW as Mean Mark Callis. And they had a match in Mission, Texas. Of course, we're from the Valley and a very pro-Hispanic crowd there. He was wrestling a Latino wrestler. I guess you could call this guy a jobber because I can't remember his name, or preliminary wrestler. A jobber, for those of you who don't know, is somebody who doesn't win matches, essentially. So Undertaker, then Mean Mark Callis, was wrestling this guy. He had him in an arm bar on the ground for like 2 minutes. And there I was, 7th grade me. I stood up, I was in the front row, and I shouted, "Hey, let's see some wrestling." And The Undertaker shouts back at me, what do you think this is, you stupid idiot? And to me, that's one of the best moments of my life. Ultimate Warrior is another great one. Sting, I love watching Sting. I thought he was underrated on the mic, tremendously talented, very just freakishly athletic, very methodical. Shawn Michaels and Bret Hart, I'm going to couple them together. I know they're sort of tied at the hip, but their 60-minute Iron Man matches they hated each other, but man, they worked so well together. And I always said, like I always tell anybody out there, if you're getting married and you get to come out to a groom song, come out to Sexy Boy by Shawn Michaels. That's my tip for you. Anybody who's getting married, you'll get a laugh. People love it. You could do his dance.
I'm not your boy toy.
Just get yourself going in the morning. Put that on when you're taking a shower, man. You'll get going. You know what? I want to one more I want to mention real quick. It's about Dusty Rhodes. I want to mention his son, Goldust, what's his real name?
Dustin
Rhodes. Goldust, man. I remember when that character came out, and I was like, "You're confused a bit. You didn't know what the fuck to expect."
He's a great character,
but it was a great character. He was a great wrestler. I remember watching his fights, and he looked like he was giving, he was putting pain on people. He sold that stuff awesome. You had to really trust this guy if you were going to let him pretend to kick you in the nuts. I mean, that shit, if you're putting yourself on the line with that one, and he made it look like it was, like it hurt. And so Goldust was also another one that, like, man, he did some awesome stuff.
Good point.
I think he was one of the first, like, psychological characters. Like, he would psychologically fuck with the other wrestlers. Some of his wrestling matches with Razor Ramon were fucking awesome.
Yeah, I think with Goldust, he was a little bit of exotic Adrian Street, who was a wrestler I used to watch a lot on Southwest. He very androgynous, kind of like Goldust. And I think the kicker with Goldust is that he would say movie quotes. Remember those early promos? He would be standing in front of the Hollywood sign, and he would say a quote from like Silence of the Lambs, and he would give the year and the title of the movie. And like this crazy music would be playing. And Dustin Rhodes before that was a very tall, kind of cowboy looking wrestler. So yeah, good call. Great gimmick. The wrestler of interest I want to dive a little bit into, guys, before our selections is we all mentioned him. I'm going to try to be the only guy on this podcast to not do a Randy Savage impression. So
do it. You know you want to.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. I could go for a Slim Jim right now. So Randy Savage is somebody we all grew up watching, loving. I actually have a few things I want to talk about and get your perspective on the Macho Man Randy Savage. Macho Man Randy Savage looked like he was from the 1960s, looked like a hippie. A nickname was from the 1970s, huge star in the 1980s. He played that jealous boyfriend to Miss Elizabeth to Hilt. I mean, everything, like George the Animal Steel would open up the ropes for her, or somebody would, wave at her, and Randy Savage would go absolutely ballistic. You got jealous eyes, Hogan, or, he would just go after. That's the worst, Randy. I'm going to edit that one out. But he was freakishly athletic. He was so bizarre and entertaining. In the late 90s, he got really roided up, and his ponytail reached Mach 5, sort of Steven Seagal style. But Randy Savage was just an incredible talent. I want to share a quick story with you guys before I get your thoughts on Macho Man Randy Savage. I met my wife the day of Randy Savage's death, May the 20th, 2011. It's going to be our 10-year anniversary of knowing each other, or meeting each other, my wife and I. We were in Austin. And I took a flight over there because I had a back injury and I was taking painkillers, and we had met online, and I said, do you mind if you pick me up at the airport, which was a sign of a terrible date to begin with, right? But she was cool about it. But before I boarded the plane, I looked at the monitor. It says wrestling legend Randy Savage, has a car accident. He had a heart attack while he was driving, and I think he hit the median or something, and he died. And so when I got out, I get off the plane. I'm going to the luggage terminal, and I see my wife or my date at the time, and so she goes, "Hey, how are you doing?" And I was like, "Well, Randy Savage died, so it's a pretty bad day so far. Let's see how this goes." I think she kind of looks at me. I don't think at the time she's like, "Yeah, I'm going to bear this man's baby someday." So I always equate one of the best days of my life, meeting my wife, with one of my worst is finding out Randy Macho Man Savage died. So kind of a funny little story I wanted to share. But guys, your thoughts on Randy Savage?
I mean, what kind of response do you think she would get? You think she would like bust out a Slim Jim from her backpack and be like, "Oh yeah, sad day, brother"? No, I think
no.
I honestly think that Macho Man Randy Savage is one of the greatest ever, probably one of the most marketable ever. He had that certain look, the highlighter tights. He looked like a fucking 80s rock band. For some reason, somebody told him throw on the cowboy hat, and he's like, "Fuck it, I wear a cowboy hat." But he was one of my favorite wrestlers. He was great on the mic. He had that instantly recognizable voice, and everybody tries to mock like we're so badly doing tonight.
Mine's pretty good.
I loved watching his. I mean, he had one of the most epic matches at WrestleMania 3 with Ricky the Dragon Steamboat, which probably really underrated. It doesn't get talked about as much. Everybody talks about Flair, Ricky the Dragon Steamboat, but Macho Man versus Ricky the Dragon Steamboat at WrestleMania 3. If you haven't seen it, check it out.
Show stealer.
He was so talented. He was really, really talented, and it was really unfortunate and he's another one that we lost pretty early.
Yeah, Joseph, I
think him and it's funny when you mention him. He was this big star in his own right, and but a lot of people might look at him as going hand in hand with Hogan. They had their whole thing back in the days. I think they appeared on Baywatch together on one episode once. Great episode, by the way. Not because of the wrestlers, but anyway.
Who had a better chest, Hasselhoff or Hogan?
Oh, Macho Man!
How dare you talk bad about Hasselhoff, sir?
But I think what a great wrestler. We all know that the persona, like we've all mentioned. I think at the end of this, before we wrap it up, we each got to say, go do an oh yeah, and one by one, and that maybe the listeners can tell us who did it best, or maybe they'll just tell us to shut the fuck up. Stop. Yeah,
I'll tell us right now to shut the fuck up.
But I think what I loved most about his Macho Man is his mic skills, if you want to call them mic skills. Just the talk, the voice, the things he would say, the cream rises to the top, too sweet to be sour. He was great. It was entertaining. It was funny. He was a high flyer. He had his elbow off the top ropes was when he landed that thing awesome. Because back it's a lot of the back in the days when we talk about wrestling and the purity of it, a lot of these guys they didn't screw up a lot, so it made it look 10 times better when he landed that thing, and you see him flying in the air and the elbow dropping, and it was awesome. But I think his mic skills, I remember most about him being awesome. He's definitely up there on the list of the greatest to do it. And like we've already said, just a tragic loss. The way it happened, that's not the way you want to think about anybody going. More for you, Randy. I mean, it's heartbreak and heart take, I guess.
Yeah, exactly, man. Go ahead, Bob. I know you had something to say.
I was just thinking about you, like Tony Government. Well, I mean, Macho Man died, so that's a great day. So you think it's Arby's or?
I was just thankful you didn't mention Stephanie McMahon this go around. I know you had an anecdote about her, but Macho Man, I think the only bad thing I could say about Randy Savage is what the hell was he doing thinking to pin Yokozuna at a Royal Rumble instead of trying to throw him over the rope?
No. The question would be, what the hell was he thinking putting out a rap song?
Be a man, Hogan. Yes.
Be a man, Hogan.
So we're going to go ahead and go to our selections. I'm going to start off first, and I would be remiss and regretful if I didn't bring up my favorite. This is actually 3 generations of my family spanning this man as our favorite wrestler. My father introduced me to this man's matches when he wrestled at the Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling. He was a wonderful champion. And my son doesn't know who like Seth Rollins and Kenny Omega and all these guys are. My son watches old school 80s wrestling with me, and he loves this guy as much as I do. Ric Flair. I had to go with the Rolex wearing, diamond ring wearing, kiss stealing, wheeling dealing, limousine riding, jet flying son of a gun, and I'm having a hard time holding these New Balance dad shoes down. So I had to go with Ric Flair, 16-time world champion, spanning from 1981 to 1999. Though I argue Ric Flair was probably done with his peak around 1994. He was already kind of running out of steam. You have to account that even though it's predetermined, you have to have a great worldwide representative, and that's what Ric Flair was. Ric Flair was so loyal to the NWA. For those of you who don't know, we talked about it a little bit. The WWF obviously ruled the 80s when Vince McMahon decided, I'm not going to be part of the NWA anymore. Territories all were immersed in the NWA. And Ric Flair was their champion for many times. It was probably closer to 21 championships, because in the Dominican Republic in 1982, he changed the match midway, the result, to a wrestler by the name of Jack Veneno. Because if you watch this, Google Ric Flair versus Jack Veneno, the Dominican fans are about to go crazy. It is loud there. And Ric Flair looked around and you could see the oh shit look on his face. Like, I better lose this match, because if I don't lose this match, they're going to riot. He did this with Carlos Colon too in Puerto Rico. And these championship exchanges weren't recognized because they weren't scripted in. Ric Flair just said, hey, I have to lose this match because I want to save my life. I remember, I think in his book, he mentions in Puerto Rico, they beat Carlos Colon, and he traveled with Roddy Piper. And they were leaving, and the owner of the federation or whatever paid them off, and they're rushing out back to their hotel. And Ric Flair realizes, I'm short on this cash. And Roddy Piper said, you got cash? All they paid me with was this. And it was like a spittoon of cocaine. And it was just crazy in the 80s. And I think Ric Flair exemplified it. Survived the 1975 plane crash about 3 years into his in-ring career. It was a twin-engine Cessna plane. Fuel was going down low. It was he suffered a serious back issues. The pilot died. Johnny Valentine, who's Greg the Hammer Valentine's father, he suffered a paralysis. His back was compressed in 3 places, but he came back after 4 months. And after 4 months in 1975, he decided, hey, I'm living the Playboy life. I'm changing my name to Nature Boy Ric Flair, which was a sort of a tip of the hat to Buddy Rogers, who was the original Nature Boy. Nobody bled like Ric Flair. That crimson mask, as Gordon Soley would call it. He wasn't a body guy. He wasn't overly roided. He wasn't the most athletic wrestler, but damn it, if he wasn't a great storyteller in the ring. His ring psychology, he was working body parts. He was playing to the crowds. I loved it when he would beg for mercy, especially when he would wrestle somebody like Sting or Ricky the Dragon Steamboat. He would chop them and they wouldn't sell the chops anymore. And he would just like, oh God, he would start begging for mercy. He would shove the ref and the ref would shove him back, and he would do the flop. He did that turnbuckle flop where he'd run to the other side to do a cross body block, I imagine, but he'd always get slammed off the top turnbuckle. I would always love it when the wrestlers would pause and he would like start begging, like, don't slam me. And they would just slam him anyway. But he was a marathon man. It wasn't unusual for Flair to wrestle 300 plus days out of the year. Many of those matches would go 60 minutes. He made average wrestlers look great. Lex Luger, Vader, Hulk Hogan, Kerry Von Erich, who weren't the best wrestlers, he made them look great. There was a film studio where the NWA Georgia Championship Wrestling would take place. And there was a match that was supposed to take place, Lex Luger versus Ric Flair. Lex Luger was ill. So Ric Flair said, I'll wrestle George South, who was a jobber preliminary wrestler, didn't win a lot of matches. And they kept the same script. And he made George South look like $1 million, close falls, a great back and forth wrestling. So Ric Flair made everybody look good. He would even wrestle tag wrestlers in singles competition. Road Warrior Hawk, he wrestled at the Great American Bash. Ricky Morton from the Rock and Roll Express. He had great chemistry with great rivalry. Some wrestlers are lucky to have one great rival that they could really. The Flair did it with 4 individuals. Ricky Steamboat, who we've mentioned Ricky Steamboat a lot. He's just a tremendous athlete. Sting, Dusty Rhodes, Terry Funk, Ric Flair's work ethic. He lived the gimmick. He spent so much money to maintain his lifestyle. I remember he was almost broke, but he had to look like $1 million because that was his gimmick. He was partying all night. And I remember Jim Ross had mentioned in the documentary that Ric Flair would close down bars. It would be 4:00 in the morning. And then Jim Ross had an early wake up call to do TV. And it was like 7:30, 8:00 in the morning. And he would see Ric Flair there lifting weights, running the treadmills. Like, how is this guy functioning? And he's doing this constantly. His interviews were just stuff of legend. His energy, his voice, his cadence. He could be funny. He could be serious. He was like a cross between Al Pacino in Scarface and Richard Gere in American Gigolo. He was just so charismatic. His pop culture references, always talking about the ladies, jewelry, fast cars. And he would be a great promoter in promoting cities. I'm going to give you my 3 funniest Ric Flair lines. He was wrestling this wrestler by the name of Magnum TA, who looked like Tom Selleck. And he told Magnum TA, how can you expect to be a world champion with a body like that? You look like Jim Cornette with his shirt off. Jim Cornette was a pear-shaped manager of the Midnight Express. He told Ronnie Garvin, you want to be champion when you're riding down the road with that golden retriever you call a woman. And I could not stop laughing. And then lastly, there was a wrestler by the name of Buddy Landel. He called himself the Nature Boy 2, another bleach blonde wrestler. And he told Buddy Landel and completely just eviscerated him, ended his career on this line. Buddy Landel, last year I spent more money on spilled liquor in bars from one side of this world to the other than you made. And we never heard from Buddy Landell again. WWE gave him a second life. He won the 92 Royal Rumble, spent a little time there, came back to WCW. Wasn't much, he won a couple of championships, but I think the Ric Flair of the peak period was long gone. Came back to WWF, won the tag team titles with Batista, won the Intercontinental title from Carlito, who's Carlos Colon's son, had a memorable retirement match with Shawn Michaels in 2007. So, winning the IC title, the tag title, and the world title. He's the Triple Crown champion. And then, of course, that retirement match with Shawn Michaels in 2007. Although he didn't retire, Flair continuously wrestled until 2011 with TNA. He was long past his prime, looked horrible and haggard, but I like to remember the Ric Flair of my childhood, the Ric Flair from 1981 to 1994. That Ric Flair, I think, is incomparable, the best wrestler I've ever seen, best on the mic, best on the market. He suffered because he wasn't a pop culture icon. He never made that jump to the WWE in its prime. He waited till he was 43 years old. He was towards the tail end of his career, but that's my defense. I love Ric Flair. Guys, what are your thoughts on Flair?
First off, to be the man, you got to beat the man.
Yes.
Ric Flair was undoubtedly one of the best on the mic. I mean, on camera, his mic skills were just incomparable. I mean, you can't really compare him to a lot of the guys because he was just amazing every single time he got in the mic. And of course, no one sold the shot like Flair. Like you talked about him begging or him doing the flip off the turnbuckle. One of my favorite ones is where somebody would give him a good shot and he would like take 3 steps, like walking away, and then he'd do this stupid fall where he'd go like and take a nosedive onto the canvas. Really comical, really funny. I loved every single time he did that. It always made me laugh. He was that cool bad guy, not necessarily a bad guy, but he was a heel character that he still rooted for. He talked a lot of smack, and he was this, like I said, jet riding, stealing, dealing kind of guy, but you still rooted for him, even though he was the heel. He was a heel with the Four Horsemen. He was a heel in his overall character, but you still rooted for the guy. Unprecedentedly, ton of great skills. His opening music and him walking out in that Barachi robe, right? It screams wrestling. I don't think that he had the look, though, once he lost the robe and everything like that. He wasn't one of these, 80 action stars, superhero type bodies. He didn't necessarily have the look, but God damn it, he had the mic skills and he had the wrestling skills. One of the other big arguments I have against him, he really didn't have that iconic moment for me. We have a lot of iconic moments, the Bret Hart versus Shawn Michaels. They had that iconic moment in their matches. The Mick Foley getting tossed off a 30-foot cage. That was an iconic moment. Looking back, I just can't see that one moment, that iconic moment that I could point to Ric Flair having. And I think maybe you're right. Look, maybe he joined the WWE too late, a little bit past his prime, and he kind of missed his big opportunity for that pop culture.
What about the 92 Rumble would be my argument. I mean, that was one of the greatest Royal Rumbles in history.
Yeah, and I can agree with that, but there's a lot of great Rumbles, in 94, that Bret Hart versus Lex Luger, where they both go over the top rope at the same time and they land feet down and we don't know who the winner is. That was a great fucking Rumble. The following year, Shawn Michaels being showing up number one and lasting to the end. And it looks like he gets knocked out by the British Bulldog, but only 1 foot touches and he flips himself back in the ring, of course, and he knocks the British Bulldog off. Big controversy. I thought that Royal Rumble was fucking amazing too. I mean, there's a lot of great Royal Rumbles. What do you think about it, Joe?
I always looked at Ric Flair as he's great. He's always been this great character, this over the top monumental person. But I always looked at Ric Flair. Some of the things that you said, Randy, that I think kind of can go against him. It's the waiting to get into the and maybe that wasn't his choice, or maybe we're not going to go, we can't go into the business decisions, the money, all that, but the getting into the WWF at the time late, this matchup that he was supposed to have with Hulk Hogan so early on in their careers, but that never happened late. Not to say that it was a bad match. And what you said about his the technical style or the things that he did in the ring, making other wrestlers looking good, maybe that's the bad thing against him. He was I always look at Ric Flair as the greatest wrestling performer, showman of the industry. He made wrestlers look good. Not necessarily made himself look good, but he made other wrestlers look good. He made other wrestlers look like they punched him, like he got punched in the face, and it was so bad that he walked away like we mentioned, that's one of the funniest things in the world is to see him fucking walk away and then 1, 2, 3, and then boom. I'm sorry, I hit the table. My bad. I apologize. But to see him go so flat to the ground, and I clapped. I'm making more noise. I apologize. Is legs right out from underneath him up in the air. Great, entertaining stuff. But I look at Flair as this. He is probably the greatest wrestling showman ever. Performer. He put on a show. He cared for his fans, which is great. That we got to see great shows. Lived the life that he portrayed as his character. Maybe that was a bad thing, depending on how you want to look at it.
Led to a lot of divorces. Yeah.
Yeah. Unfortunately,
but he also did sleep with over 1,000 women. So let's give him some credit here.
Well, that's nowhere near Wilt. Anyway. But that's another story. That's another podcast. Anyway, one that we probably won't do. But I always thought Ric Flair and as far as iconic moments, Bob, maybe I agree with your point, but maybe he did have one. But the thing is, it's the iconic moment that wasn't that retirement match that he had with Shawn Michaels. Great. It was entertaining. It was a beautiful thing. It was supposed to be his retirement. It was supposed to be the end. We all know how it happened. Before Shawn kicks him with the sweet chin music, he tells him, "I'm sorry, I love you." Boom, he's out, he's done. That was supposed to be the end. That probably could have been that iconic moment, Bob. Maybe not super iconic, but it could have been an iconic retirement, but it wasn't. And what's sad about it is they did the whole thing for him behind the scenes, where everybody came out to wish him, the happy retirement. You even got the Undertaker to come out and break character. Rarely, the one of the most rare moments in wrestling, kayfabe, anything, you see the Undertaker break character, do his thing. I mean, it was a beautiful moment. Unfortunately, I think it was like 8 months to maybe 9, he was wrestling for TNA again. So unfortunately, Bob, I agree with your point, but as far as greatest wrestler, greatest showman, he definitely was. He put on a show, and I enjoyed every show. I'm telling you.
I can agree with that.
Before we move on to your selection, Joseph, I do agree with you guys. I think he went on a little too long. There was nobody like Flair in the 80s, and he exemplified everything from the feathered hair to the tinted glasses to the suits to the titles to the rings to the women. He was everything that exemplified what was cool in the 80s, right? Of course, a lot of those things don't age so well nowadays, but I mean, Flair was just growing up, just an icon, and I think maybe his loyalty was a detriment in terms of could he have made a bigger pop culture splash had he jumped to the WWE sooner than WWF. Rappers love him now. I think he's getting a lot of cred that he didn't get before, but I mean, is it a little too late? I mean, that's something that's still left to be argued. But Joseph, let's go on to your pick.
Okay, so like where I mentioned to you with Ric Flair, I chose who I believe the greatest showman of all time, and I went with Stone Cold Steve Austin. The Texas Rattlesnake. We all know he got his start, his first major start, at least with a major promotion with WCW. Later spent some time with ECW. There's an awesome promo that he cut. You can find it on YouTube where he's doing it's basically the Stone Cold before he was Stone Cold, and it's awesome. It's authentic. I think this is really Flair, where he lived that lavish life that he portrayed. It wasn't a lavish life for Stone Cold, but it's the life that he lived, and I think he portrayed it good anyway. So I'm going to talk about Steve Austin, born in Texas, like I said, Texas Rattlesnake. Stone Cold started out in the WWF as the ringmaster. He was awarded the $1 Million Championship by his manager, Ted DiBiase.
Terrible character.
Awful. So glad he got out of that.
Yes, very much so. A stupid belt either way. As far as real championships, don't count that $1 Million Championship. And I'm not going to get too far into his belts, but he was a 6-time WWF champion, a 2-time Intercontinental champion, and a 4-time tag team champion. He actually did win the Rumble 3 times. So King of the Ring, which I'm going to get into right now. So it wasn't long before he thought that the ringmaster gimmick was weak, and he asked for a change, went to management, and whether Vince knew it at the time or not, it's probably the best, greatest decision that he made, because I believe this is what later saved the company. The WWF gave him a list of names inspired by murderer Richard Kuklinski, dubbed the Iceman.
Good HBO doc, yeah.
Horrible person, but yeah, great doc. But anyway, but so they gave him this list of names inspired by this person, and some of those names were Otto Van Ruthless, Ice Dagger, Fang McFrost, and Chili McFreeze.
Sounds like Tim Burton Batman characters.
Horrible. I mean, imagine yourself a wrestler and you're wanting to make a name for yourself in the WWE or Vince or anybody brings you a list and you see a name like Fang McFrost. Like, what the fuck are you going to do with that? Let alone Chili McFreeze. What is this, like a fucking an item off of the McDonald's menu? Or I mean, what the hell is that? Chili McFreeze? I mean, come on. Anyway, so horrible names. Anyway, so he later got the Stone Cold persona from something that his wife said to him, his then wife at the time. She was an English woman. And of course, as we've been led to believe in TV, film, and newspaper and news in general, I don't know if it's true, but if it is, oh well, it's no big deal. English people set aside time for tea. So anyway, his wife told him to drink, made him some tea, poured him the tea, and set it there and said, "Hey, be sure to drink the tea before it becomes stone cold." And so this, I don't know why, but this it sounds good. It stuck with him. Stone Cold Steve Austin. I mean, it ended up being one of the greatest names ever, I guess.
I remember Conan O'Brien saying it's a good thing she didn't say your tea is getting a tad chilly. Your name would be Tad Chili.
Tad Chili, Stone Cold Tad Chili. That's funny. So anyway, it was the 1996 King of the Ring pay-per-view, and we probably watched it together. If not, I mean, separate. I know we were watching it at some point. Anyway, it was the King of the Ring tournament, and he defeated Jake the Snake Roberts to win this tournament. At the time, Jake the Snake was portraying this born-again Christian type persona, and so as they're walking him out, they're congratulating Steve Austin for winning. At the time, he's just Steve Austin. He had dumped the ringmaster gimmick because there's a whole backstory with Ted DiBiase. If he lost the match, Ted DiBiase would have to leave. But anyway, it has to do with him leaving the company in general, going to WCW. But anyway, so he's Stone Cold Steve Austin. He's Steve Austin at this time, and he defeats Jake the Snake. And as Jake the Snake is leaving, he cuts this probably the most memorable promos ever in wrestling history. And I quote, "You sit there and you thump your Bible and you say your prayers, and it didn't get you anywhere. Talk about your Psalms. Talk about John 3:16. Well, Austin 3:16 says, I just whooped your ass."
That's an impression.
No, it's horrible. But I mean, and there it is. The Stone Cold Steve Austin image is born. And I mean, I remember I watched the video of it before we started doing this again, just to refresh my memory. And man, I watched it and I got, fuck, man, that's an awesome moment. Anyway, so, things that I didn't catch when I was watching that is, Jake the Snake I was a fan of Jake the Snake. A lot of people were fans of Jake the Snake.
Good psychologist. Yeah.
Yeah. As he's being carried out and they're congratulating Steve Austin, there's people booing in the crowd. I mean, there's actually, Jake the Snake was a good guy. Not out of the ring, but you cheered for him anyway. So Jake the Snake's being out, there's people booing, and once Austin says, "I just whooped it," Austin 3:16 says, "I just whooped your ass," the crowd loses it. They start cheering for this guy. It was amazing. It was like they were booing him to the lead up, but when he finally said something and talked the shit and talked the talk, people lost it and they cheered, and it was the beginning of something special. His rise to stardom, probably the most untelegraphed stroke of luck on part by the WWE, and man, did they need it when it happened. He was the face of the Attitude Era, the greatest era in WWE history. I think back to the time between the Monday Night Wars when the WWF at the time was struggling. WCW was taking a lot of the talent, paying them more money, and kind of letting them do what they wanted to do. Love it or hate it, Eric Bischoff was a smart businessman. Ultimately, his refusal to change said business tactics is probably what led to his downfall. But Vince made that change. He was open to making that change. He was open to this new WWF era of a more adult, not that kind of adult, mature, not that kind of mature programming style.
Well, Venus would say it's that kind of mature and that kind of adult. But anyway,
but programming style lady. That was succeeding with WCW, because WCW was doing some things. Vince finally decided to do this, and leading the charge was Stone Cold Steve Austin. Is a foul mouth, shut the hell up, I'm gonna whoop your ass, and that's the bottom line. Stone Cold said so. It was a time we talked about the last one about the change in the music style of the 90s, it kind of, maybe you could say it affected, you know, the attitudes of the people watching wrestling too. We wanted that hit. We wanted that anger. We wanted that somebody that was not going to take shit. You know, I think back to his angles with Bret Hart, that whole time where he's going back and forth with the call outs, the relentless challenges for him to fight him. You know, Bret was a babyface at the time. The crazy shit that he did with Brian Pillman. Yes, it was all scripted, but if you were watching this at home, you didn't know what was going on. And we're not going to get into the whole scripted and whatever. This is just, it was entertaining stuff. The whole Brian's got a gun thing, great stuff. I remember watching that, and
I thought it was Jenny had a gun.
Janie, actually.
Janie, it's Croce. Anyway,
a few cocktails.
Anyway, you know, that whole angle was just insane, and it was and people were eating it up. He was the heel, he was the bad guy, but they loved it. His trash talk. He can get on that mic and just completely destroy his opponent and talk shit to the crowd. I mean, the crowd loved it. He didn't really. It took him a while to actually acknowledge that he was being. I don't want to say he was the babyface, but
anti-hero.
The anti-hero. It took him a while to accept, and maybe that was on the part of the management, but it took a while before he accepted the fact that people were loving his anti-hero persona, the trash talk, the stuff that he did with the Vince McMahon, the entire family, the whole, I mean, just who doesn't want to every now and then just like throw an apple, stick it to the boss. I'll just say throw an apple at him or put a pie in the face. I don't want to say anything too, aggressive, but this is a dude walking around in black Speedo and black boots with a bald head. I mean, he didn't take no shit. And if you said anything about how he looked, he was going to whoop your ass. He definitely sold his shows, but you want to talk about toughness. I know we've talked about Foley. I put Steve Austin on this too. The dedication to his matches, and that match with Bret Hart where he's in the sharpshooter. He got cut earlier and he's bleeding, his blood gushing down his face. I think that's one of the greatest scenes. He's screaming and in pain, and there's blood rushing down his face, and he passes out. Awesome stuff. And then of course the time that he broke his neck was broken, unfortunately, by Owen Hart.
Yes. Pile driver.
Pile driver. I mean, continuing the match when he's in, I mean, that's a serious injury. The dedication, the trash talk. I mean, it was a time when WWF was struggling, and they put their hopes and dreams, or just of continuing their business, on the back of Stone Cold, and he took them and he led them to new heights. You can say maybe DX started this first, but I think it was Stone Cold. Stone Cold was the one who really led the charge in securing and, saving the business of the WWF, now WWE, and then allowing them to go do, like I said, Bischoff maybe ran, beating the dead horse with taking the old wrestlers, and just, it kind of got older after a while. They weren't doing what WWF was doing. And this is why I chose Stone Cold. I think he was the greatest. He led this company to new heights. He was the whole Austin 316 shirts. It was the bottom line. Stone Cold said so. Some of the most memorable quotes and most quoted things by fans, and that's why I went with Stone Cold Steve Austin.
It's hard to argue against Stone Cold. Steve Austin. He was definitely the king of the Attitude Era. This badass bad guy, like you said, the bad guy, the heel that everybody still fucking rooted for, and you're wondering why, because he was just so different. Everybody was tired at that point, I think, of just rooting for the superhero. It's more like that anti-hero, like Randy was saying right now. Mm-hmm. He had great matches with Shawn Michaels, The Rock, Triple H, The Undertaker, and I really do feel like not to side with you in any way, he had that iconic moment with Bret Hart where he's bleeding profusely from his face. Is in the sharpshooter, but he never fucking taps, and he ends up passing out, and that kind of like made him into like this bigger than life, this next generation superstar.
It was actually, I'm sorry, it was actually a double heel switch there. Like the fans hated. They turned on Bret Hart because he kept the hold on for so long, and then it turned Steve Austin into that anti-hero. I'm sorry, go ahead.
For sure. No, that's great. And that's when the legend of Steve Austin started. Having said that, just like I always do, just like Shawn Michaels told the Nature Boy Ric Flair, I'm sorry and I love you, but I have to disagree. In order to be the greatest, I mean, you have to look at the big picture, the whole picture, his entire career. You look at the WCW days and his gimmicks didn't really pop. They didn't really pan out. You know, we talked about the ringmaster being when he first arrived into the WWE. It didn't really like hit. It wasn't really a thing. Try to make it a thing, but Stone Cold had to take it into his own hands to be like, no, I'm going to be this new character, this Stone Cold, this badass who doesn't take any shit, and that's more like himself, right? His character himself is probably one of the best characters ever, and it fit the time period so well. But looking at the big picture, his entire career, you can't call him the greatest ever if his entire career doesn't fit that mold. He had one of the best runs ever, and nobody can fucking argue that. But it was an 8-year run. It was from 95 to 2003. Unfortunately, due to injuries and due to old age, and he'd been in the business for a long fucking time, he had to retire. So I don't think that somebody who had an 8-year run, only an 8-year run, as badass as it was, I mean, he was one of my fucking favorites. This is in the heyday where I would watch wrestling religiously. I don't feel like you can say that he's the best ever because of the limited time period that he was in. What do you think, Ren?
I think you make a good point. And I was just thinking about anti-heroes, and the 2000s when they rolled around, we had a lot of anti-heroes, Sopranos, The Wire, Breaking Bad. And now that I really think of it, did Stone Cold Steve Austin really kick up that or bring back the anti-hero as something that was prevalent and ubiquitous around our televisions? I mean, the anti-hero notion has been around for a long time. I remember Stone Cold Steve Austin from his very beginnings. He was Steve Williams in the USWA. He had to change his name because there was already a Steve Williams, Dr. Death Steve Williams. I remember reading Mick Foley's book, Have a Nice Day. And Steve Austin, who's from Victoria, Texas, started his training under Chris Adams, who he later stole Chris Adams' wife, British woman, Joseph, that you mentioned, used to be married. That was his trainer's wife. So shame on Steve Austin. Anyway, Mick
that's the bottom line.
Love is love. Love is love.
Mick Foley Mick Foley was wrestling in the USWA World Class Championship Wrestling, which used to be owned by Fritz von Erich. And he said he would see Chris Adams train these wrestlers because they would train after the cards. They would train very late at night. He's like, all these guys were horrible, but there was this one tall blonde guy who was incredible. He was so fluid. He was built, and that was Steve Williams, aka later known as Steve Austin, who had his time in WCW with the Hollywood Blondes with Brian Pillman, came to the WWE as the ringmaster. Luckily, that if you want to watch something surreal, watch one of his first Rumbles. I think it was 96. I'm not 100% sure, where he's Stone Cold Steve Austin. The glass breaks. There's no crowd reaction. And you're like, this is Stone Cold Steve Austin, but he was just in the genesis of building that character. So if you want to watch a surreal moment, watch his first
I want to say it's 97. It's 97 when he starts eliminating people and he's kind of like just developing that character.
Nobody's popping for him. And it's just so weird. The WWF was very fortunate to have him in the Rock at the same time. I remember hearing interviews with Jim Ross mentioning, like, we would have loved to have the Rock and then Stone Cold or vice versa, but we lucked out. And I think he was very fortunate to have that. Injuries did slow him down. The Owen Hart pile driver, as you mentioned, almost ended his career. And it also changed a lot of rules. I think the WWF banned like certain pile drivers and power bombs that they couldn't use anymore. He took that natural born killers gimmick and he ran with it. I always say, like, one of the things that reminds me of Stone Cold Steve Austin is the Woody Harrelson character, Natural Born Killer. So, kudos to him for attributing that to some of his influences in building the character. He was profitable, influential, was a big part of the best feud of all time with Vince McMahon. I think to be the chosen one, he had some of the funniest storylines with Vince McMahon. I don't know if you guys remember when Vince McMahon was in the hospital and he was like in a horrible like back room. It didn't even look like a hospital. It looked like he was in the back of a gymnasium. Yes. And then Steve Austin is like,
the dog with the bedpan.
I'll take it from here, nurse.
I'll take it from here, nurse.
He just beats the crap out of him with a bedpan.
And like I said, he sold that stuff. So he looked like he was beating on his leg hardcore, and he wasn't, but
Didn't he put an enema of Vince McMahon's ass? He did
something like that.
And
I think that was a rated R version you were watching.
I think he benefited from the McMahon storyline. Of course, that was on the heels of the Montreal Screwjob. Everybody hated Vince McMahon. We all knew he was the owner that grew Bret Hart. You could have put anybody against Vince McMahon in a storyline because his character was just so hated. You could have put Al Snow. You could have put anybody else. But Steve Austin was a chosen one. I think he benefited from that. He benefited from the Attitude Era, benefited from having the Rock around. And redneck culture was very prevalent at the time. I think you had the Blue Comedy Tour that might have been around the time where like Duck Dynasty and Honey Boo Boo and all this reality redneck stuff started happening. And I think Steve Austin also forgot that singer Toby Keith who's terrible. I think all those things were coming into play at the time.
I love this bar.
I'm just saying, I know people have mentioned that. I never thought of Stone Cold as this redneck character,
I think Jim Ross would call him the Bionic Redneck. I think that was one of his.
I don't remember that. I just personally, I didn't see it.
I remember Texas Redneck.
He's Texas. He's Texas, I guess country, I guess if you want to call it anything. I wouldn't call it redneck, but I'm sorry. Keep going.
No, and I just had one last, if any of these points don't really manifest, I think this last point does. Bad News Brown, I don't know if you guys remember him, was a wrestler in the late 80s from Harlem. He was a African-American character, shaved head, goatee, black Speedos, trunks, whatever you want to call it. Just, I think the WWF missed the boat with Bad News Brown, and he was kind of the predecessor to Stone Cold. And for whatever reason, it didn't work with Bad News Brown. Maybe it was just maybe his mic skills weren't as good or whatever. But I always thought
also he was a nut job.
I always considered Bad News Brown the predecessor to Stone Cold, and maybe Stone Cold borrowed a few things, maybe the shaved head, the goatee, the black trunks, I don't know, and a little bit of a cross between Bad News Brown and Dick Murdoch. So it wasn't really self-manifested, I think. But that's what brilliant people do, right? They borrow. You can't, like we argued bands last week. Some of the best bands in the world, like Nirvana, I mean, they borrowed from the Pixies, and they borrowed from the Melvins and all these other bands. Stone Cold, I think, borrowed from a lot of individuals. We mentioned some of the HBO murder documentaries. We mentioned Natural Born Killers, Bad News Brown. I think a lot of it was not all self-manifested. I think it was smart business because he knew what was hot at the time and what people liked, but I don't think he was self-created the way Ric Flair was self-created. I think a lot of his promos were himself, obviously. I think a lot of his sayings were himself, but I also think Stone Cold was the character Stone Cold and didn't really live that character life the way Ric Flair did. But I can't argue the money he made for the company. I can't argue him saving the WWF. I don't think he was the best wrestler. As Bob mentioned, I think that 8-year period. And unfortunately, there's no knock on Stone Cold, but he wasn't able to move the way he was before the Owen Hart injury or before Owen Hart injured him. So we didn't get those classic matches, but he did have some great ones with The Rock and Bret Hart. I don't think he had as many as Ric Flair did. And that's my only knock on him. I think, the longevity maybe and some of the injuries caught up to him. But other than that, I mean, he's a fun,
actually,
wrestler.
If you read up on it, his hair was thinning at the time. He was already battling that. He took his inspiration as far as shaving his head. He was watching Pulp Fiction, a great movie. He saw Bruce Willis. So
really?
I think that's also a really, really cool fun fact. He saw Pulp Fiction. He saw the character that Bruce Willis was portraying, obviously. I mean, but that's just Bruce Willis's look, shaved head. And that's what he decided. He was like, that's what I'm going to do. That's what I'm going to do. And then like a day later backstage, he took a razor to his head and shaved it. And then about a week after that, his goatee was out, and that's what he went with.
It's hard to argue Stone Cold Steve Austin, but Bob, who'd you select and why?
Well, thinking about it, when we first mentioned the topic, you picked the Nature Boy Ric Flair, and Joseph picked, Stone Cold Steve Austin. Those are just really amazing picks, and it's really hard to argue against those guys as best we tried as best we could. But it's hard to talk about professional wrestling without mentioning the wrestling icon, the immortal Hulk Hogan. It didn't take me long to make my choice. It's a name that's just synonymous with wrestling. When you think about professional wrestling, especially in the 80s and 90s, it's Hulk Hogan. That name, they go hand in hand. He has and always will be the greatest wrestler of all time. He made wrestling relevant in what it is today, this larger than life, this billion-dollar sports entertainment industry. The success of professional wrestling was due in large part to his popularity and his superstardom. His run in the 80s after defeating the Iron Sheik in 84 at Madison Square Garden, right, the Mecca, was just unheard of. It set him on this path to be the biggest name in the history of the business. It was during this time too that he was a part of the most iconic moment in wrestling history. This was by body slamming Andre the Giant at WrestleMania 3. There's no other. I mean, you think of wrestling and you think of its history and you think of iconic moments. And I think to be the greatest, you have to have that moment. And body slamming Andre the Giant, a feat that, to me, Andre the Giant was always larger than life. He was more than just a novelty. He was just this larger than life great character that's just that when people would see him, they would just, I mean, be astounded. He's just so amazing. And for Hulk Hogan to lift him up and slam him down was just something that nobody thought they'd ever see, which, like I said, it's the most iconic moment in WWF history. And the backstory of which is extremely hilarious. If you've seen the HBO's Onto the Giant documentary, Hulk Hogan's talking about that and the lead up to the match. It's really, really great. If you haven't seen it, of course, like we always say, check it out. Hogan, he dominated the wrestling business for over 2 decades, guys, 2 decades. And he made WWF at the time the biggest wrestling organization in the world. And at the same time, years later, he almost fucking destroyed it and tore it all down during the Monday Night Wars on WCW when he made that jump as Hollywood Hulk Hogan in the NWO. The man literally carried 2 different organizations and 2 different businesses. At one time in the 80s, he took the WWE mainstream and made it what it was. And then the late 90s, he took WCW mainstream and made them more popular with higher ratings than the WWE, than WWF, which was just unheard of because the WWF at that time had always been like the marquee organization, kind of like the UFC right now. It's just so crazy that he was able to carry 2. There's no other character wrestler in the history of wrestling that was able to do that, which I feel is amazing. And yes, you might say like, oh, Ric Flair, the AWA, but that was a small market. Big market, big organizations on TNT, on USA. Hulk Hogan took over both organizations, which I feel it's monumental. And you talk about wrestlers in general. He had that 80s action star look, that Stallone, that Arnold Schwarzenegger look. He had the mic skills, let me tell you something, brother. He had some of the greatest conversations with, let me tell you something, Mean Gene, and him and Mean Gene Okerlund. Those fucking those pre-fight conversations were great, man. They were awesome. I loved his hulking up gimmick. That was one of my favorites growing up. He'd be beaten down and beaten up, and it looks like it's the end, and he'd take a shot and he starts shaking his arm, and he'd take another shot and he starts shaking his arms and hulking up. And it's something that everybody looked forward to. And in those big matches, when you saw it, you're like, yes, here comes that big comeback. He was just the way he would make the audience get into the match, whether they're cheering him on, in his late 80s run when he was the baby face, or whether they're booing him when he was Hollywood Hogan in WCW. Nobody got a bigger pop from the crowd than Hulk Hogan. Love him or hate him, he was the biggest superstar ever in the wrestling industry. It's WrestleMania 18 against The Rock. Now, Hulk Hogan obviously
Toronto,
obviously a little past his prime. He'd wrestled in the 80s when he became the superstar. In the 90s, he almost surpassed and put the WWF out of business with the WCW with the NWO. But, time had passed, and it's 2002, WrestleMania 18. He battles The Rock, and The Rock is the babyface. He is the face at this point of the WWF because Stone Cold Steve Austin's already on his way out. He's injured, and a year later he retires. So The Rock is the man. He's their babyface. He's the face of the organization. And here comes old Hulk Hogan, the icon. And they walk out into this match, and they can't even start it within 5 minutes because the crowd is going fucking nuts. And you would think, man, they're hyped up because this is Hogan versus The Rock. They're cheering The Rock's name. No, they're not. They're fucking cheering Hogan and Hogan and Hogan. And you could tell it was kind of surreal for both The Rock, probably wrestling one of his idols, and Hogan, who were standing in the ring looking around at the audience because they're going apeshit nuts, and it's not the reaction they thought they'd get. And it kind of makes me feel like it was just unreal. And every time The Rock would hit him and put Hogan down, they would boo. And then every time Hogan would hit him and put The Rock down, they would cheer and freak out. And probably the best part of the match, The Rock hits him with the rock bottom, and it looks like it's over, and he pins him, and Hogan breaks out. Then he starts the gimmick. He starts that hulking up, and everybody's losing their shit and losing their minds. It was probably one of the best moments in the history of the WWE and WrestleMania, and that's Hulk Hogan's already had so many. So I mean, he's done it all. He's played the heel. He's played the babyface. He's carried multiple organizations, and you know, I just don't think that there's any other wrestler that can top that. Has topped that. I don't think that there's any other wrestler that's done what he's done, and that's, again, and I hate to use the same phrase. You think of wrestling. You ask the common fan. Think of pro wrestling. Who do you think of? It's Hulk Hogan.
I mentioned before, I texted you guys this morning. I said, this is going to be a difficult one to argue because every pick is a winner, I think. And the point of this show is to argue who's the best. And there can only be one best. And I think in many people's eyes, people say Stone Cold, people say Hulk Hogan. A little bit about Hulk Hogan. His character was first generated by Vince McMahon Sr. And when Hogan said, hey, I have an opportunity to play Thunder Lips in Rocky III, he said, if you go and do this, you're out of my federation. So Hogan said, this is a one in a lifetime opportunity. Of course, it was for his benefit because he became friends with Mr. T, brought him over to WrestleMania 1. So when Hogan was fired, he jumped ship to the AWA. And that's when Hulkamania was born. A lot of people think, well, Hulkamania is a WWF thing. It's actually an AWA thing where he was wrestling to the title. Everybody thought he was going to be the next AWA champion and beat Nick Bockwinkel at the time. But he jumped ship to the WWF, and it was a rocket ship. I mean, he became the biggest thing in wrestling. To say something, and I think the last compliment I'll give Hulk Hogan is that Chris Hemsworth is doing a biodoc on Hulk Hogan. He says, man, this guy was huge. He's working out like crazy because he's like, I can't get to this guy's size because his weightlifting regimen was, of course, there was, you know, we won't get into steroids, but his regimen is of legend. When you see Hulk Hogan as Apex, the guy was a freakishly big guy. I felt that his character, to me, and I don't know if you'll agree with this, but his character kept the same essence in the WWF and was more geared towards children. I love the NWO change of character because I think he needed it. But I think if he had done that years before, we'd be talking about Hulk Hogan as one of the biggest angles in the WWF turning heel. He didn't do that. He kept the character until it went stale. And actually, he was apprehensive when Eric Bischoff said, hey, we're going to turn you heel. I got this great idea from Japan, and we're going to do the NWO here. We're going to bring in Scott Hall and Kevin Nash. And Hogan was very apprehensive, but he went through with it. It was something that extended his career. At times during his interviews, he seemed very scripted. He was a horrible actor in No Holds Barred and Santa with Muscles, the nanny, and all that other stuff that he did was just horrible. He was a smart
Suburban
wrestler.
Commando was epic.
He was a smart wrestler, but he was also kind of mediocre. Same kind of moves. Wrestling almost took a backseat to everything else. I think Hogan was more for the fans, the interviews, the scripted stuff, the backstage stuff. It almost seemed like wrestling sort of took, and he could wrestle. I mean, if there's a YouTube match out there against the Great Muta, and this was like in the early 90s, so Hogan he was already up in age. He had a tremendous match against the Great Muta, but he didn't wrestle tremendous matches in the WWE. Now, granted, he was fighting monsters at that. He was fighting Andre, who wasn't a great wrestler because he was so old and so big at the time. King Kong Bundy, Big John Studd, but even guys like Paul Orndorff and the Ultimate Warrior, even Randy Savage, he had mediocre matches against those guys. And some of those guys, at least Savage was a great wrestler, Ted DiBiase too, but he would always have like, decent matches with those guys. And I don't think wrestling was always the thing with Hogan. I talk about Hogan being I always felt like the backstage stuff, the interviews was all about what he was about. I don't think I always thought the wrestling was secondary. Like he wanted to be the action star. He loved hanging around, rubbing elbows with Sylvester Stallone and Mr. T. The movies never manifested. He could wrestle, but he never brought that to the forefront. It was always quick matches, punches, a leg drop. I hulk up, I'll give you a body slam, and I give you, my finisher, the leg drop. One of the funny things I thought about Hulk Hogan, and I wanted to mention this, and this might have been like a continuity error. In one of the Royal Rumbles, I think it was the 88 Rumble. He eliminated Randy Savage, and they were tag team partners, but he eliminates Randy Savage. They were the Mega Powers at the time. And then Hogan's like, sorry, it's just business. You know, I'm trying to win this match, this battle royal. And Savage comes in and Savage is pissed off and he's pushing him and like, what the hell? We're buddies or whatever. And then Miss Elizabeth walks in and she's like trying to separate them. And then later on they shake hands and Savage goes, yeah, you know what? And so a couple of years later, when Sid Vicious was in the WWE as Psycho Sid and he was Sid Justice when he was a baby face, him and Hogan were friends. And Sid Vicious or Sid Justice eliminates Hogan. Hogan gets pissed off. Like, why are you eliminating me? We're friends. And then he goes inside and he eliminates Sid Justice. I'm like, what do? You just got mad at Randy Savage for coming back into the ring. And then you're doing the same thing to Sid Justice saying, hey, I thought we were friends. So let me eliminate you. What a fucking asshole. Anyway, that was my biggest gripe. And Joseph, what are your thoughts about Hulk Hogan?
I agree with the things that you said. You know, the career choices afterwards. You know, the movies. Hey, I like Suburban Commando, and actually, the Undertaker
Thunder in Paradise was cool.
The Undertaker actually comes out in Suburban Commando too. He's one of the bounty hunters. I think he has like one line. He's like, "You're a dead man, Ramsey," in a kid's voice. It's funny shit, but. The career choices outside of wrestling were obviously beneficial to him. I look at Hulk Hogan, and I'm not, and my choice with Stone Cold was because of the things that he brought to the company for his persona, and I gave a little bit of a nod to his wrestling. I agree with what Randy said. Hulk Hogan didn't have to do much in the ring. He was a physical specimen, and maybe that's I don't know whose fault that is. I really don't. Was it the gimmicks that got him through? But was he a fan favorite? Most definitely. Were people just wanting to see him like get hit a few times, hit somebody a few times, get knocked down, do the Hulk up, do the I can't hear you crowd, the whole fucking thing. Maybe that's what it was. Maybe that's all it was just his character. And maybe it goes back to my argument with Randy's and with Ric Flair is just this showman type thing for the fans. And it didn't and I know he was on the career is a very long career. Both of the wrestlers you picked both had longer careers than my pick. Unfortunately, the injuries did pile up. There was some issues. I think there was some personal stuff going on with him and management. I think they wanted him to. He needed a break and they wanted him in it and he just didn't show up. So it's a whole thing you have to go back on. I can't really hold that against Stone Cold just because it sucks that he didn't have that career, the longevity that the year two picks did. If it comes down to just a couple of boots to the face when you throw him against the ring, throw him against the ropes, and a leg drop, it's fun. It's exciting. I enjoyed watching Hulk Hogan. I love seeing. I think maybe he got better at it later on in his career, and that's maybe the problem because early on it was all it was really just the showman stuff. And I preferred maybe actually the bad attitude Hollywood Hogan as opposed to like what Randy said, the Hulk, the kids Hulk, grow up to be like the Hulk, the American dream or whatever. No, not wrong one. I'm sorry. The real American hero. I know.
That's the roads.
If American dream, that's the road.
but yeah, I mean, that's what I think.
I also,
Go ahead, Randy. Go ahead. Before I respond, go ahead, Randy.
No, I was just going to say one thing that always pissed me off is that Hogan was one of the rare guys that got real music for his entrance. He had Voodoo Child by Jimi Hendrix. And I loved how the only lyric he knew was standing next to a mountain, chop it down with the edge of my hand. And he would not sing anymore because he didn't know the rest of the song, but he would always sing that line on camera. And I was like, why doesn't he sing any more of the song? Anyway, I always thought that was
because he was too busy playing the air guitar, man. He was too busy playing the air guitar.
Go ahead, Bob.
And here's my biggest argument against you all for the reason that you all stated. Actually, thank you, Randy, because you mentioned the AWA when he started his Hulkamania career. So really, he carried 3 organizations, not 2, which kind of helps push my argument forward. Now, in the 80s, the look and everything with the 80s action star movement was huge, and we did the best action star not too long ago. We talked about Stallone, we talked about Arnold, we talked about Van Damme and Seagal and Chuck. Well, didn't talk about Chuck Norris, probably should have. Anyways, he fit that mold so perfectly. So he wasn't Andre the Giant where he just had to stand there and choke slam you. He was mobile. He did things. He wasn't just against the rope, a foot kick and a leg drop. He did the whole thing. He sold a lot of shots. He really did sell. We talked about Ric Flair selling shots. Hulk Hogan sold a lot of shots.
I'll give him that. He did sell.
He was really great at that. His mic skills were extremely good too. But one thing that I feel like it's very, very underrated is that he completely changed characters and it fucking sold and hit and went over so well. And he was able to use that to carry another organization. Yeah, he was the say your prayers and eat your vitamins kids and little Hulkamaniacs all around, and that kid friendly, because, you know, the 80s was all about Saturday morning cartoons and cereal and watching wrestling and shit like that. It was more focused towards the kids. So he fit that persona well. But in the Attitude Era, which you could call it for the WWF, was really hit the WCW too as well. He was able to change characters, become that heel, even against his will. He was like, fuck, I don't really want to do this, because it was a huge, he created this huge mountain of a character, and Hulk Hogan, the Hulkster, and the red and yellow, and, you know, the good guy image. And for him to totally go against it, it was a fucking make it or break it for his career. It could have easily gone south and ended his career right then and there, but it didn't. He fucking sold it, and he became this larger than life Hollywood Hogan, which I fucking find better than the actual Hulk Hogan, Hulkamaniac, Hulkster, the immortal Hulk Hogan. I loved the Hollywood Hogan little era that he had in WCW and briefly in the WWF. So I think that makes him stand out. I think that makes him a standalone, that he was two different characters. And one of the reasons why we didn't choose The Undertaker is because really he's had one character his entire career that hit, and he never quite evolved. He tried the American Badass, didn't really work. Ric Flair had one character his entire career. It hit. He stuck with it. Stone Cold Steve Austin took him forever to find one. He found that one character. He stuck with it. You know what I mean? And Hulk Hogan was already famous. He hit the lotto. He was this larger than life character. And what did he do? Fuck it. Let's try something else. And he made it work. And he made that character, Hollywood Hogan, larger than life. So I think that's what makes him elite. And that's what makes him stand up above the rest.
Do you think that it was more him as far as the switch to the promotion, or the Scott Hall and Kevin Nash? Who was it more? No, I think it was, because I kind of think it was Scott Hall and Kevin Nash. Those two dudes, they had already started laying the groundwork for these two, the outsiders thing. Okay. So I know it worked in WCW, but I think it's more Kevin Nash and Scott Hall.
Well, let me respond to your question. Was it with your question with another question? Was it more of a surprise to seeing Scott Hall and Kevin Nash in WCW and doing this like being the bad guys? Or was it more of a fucked up surprise that Hulk Hogan, the all-American good guy, turned heel? I think it was the biggest surprise and the biggest shock in the entire wrestling world was Hulk Hogan turning heel.
I think Hogan at the time, to salvage his career, because he still wanted to wrestle, he had to turn heel. He was getting booed like on in WCW. He came in for the rating spike, feuded with the Big Show or the Giant, as he was known as the time.
To get paid too, actually, to be honest with you.
Yeah, he got paid. He got that Ted Turner money.
He wasn't going to get that stuff from Vince anymore.
Yeah, and because Vince was already like
going broke, man. Yeah. He was losing.
And they were moving on to other things. And so when Hogan was getting booed and everything and had a sort of a career retrospective, I guess, and really thinking about what he needed to do, he needed this angle. As much as we say, okay, well, it's Hogan, and that's why it was so impactful. This was all ushered in by Eric Bischoff's ideas, by Hall and Nash coming in. And I think that overall group impact really elevated that NWO angle, because Hogan had some of his worst matches as an NWO affiliate, and he didn't do a lot. He had some really big stinkers. You heard the finger pointing of doom with Kevin Nash and some of these other things that went awry during the NWO stuff. And the NWO stuff was awesome for about a year. Then it grew kind of stale. And Hogan, to his discredit, would not put over the young guys like Billy Kidman, Eddie Guerrero. Guys were leaving because Hogan wasn't doing the job. He was already, in his late 40s, and he wasn't putting over these guys like Jericho, Malenko, Benoit. He was not doing the job.
That's also too. But also too, like if you talk about Billy Kidman small, Chris Jericho small, Eddie Guerrero small. Imagine a guy that small trying to beat Andre the Giant. There's no way you could have Andre the Giant lose to these guys. He was a larger than life character, and I think at this point, the immortal Hulk Hogan was a larger than life character, and having him lose to anybody other than maybe Goldberg, who matched him in size, who matched him in strength and build and all this other stuff, you couldn't lose to these younger guys that were smaller than you. But he lost to Goldberg, he lost to Sting. You know what I mean? I think
it took the WCW's version of Stone Cold to knock him off. You know?
There was when Hogan returned to the WWF or WWE after the WCW shut down, he wrestled Shawn Michaels. I don't remember the year. It was a SummerSlam match, and he refused to lose to Shawn Michaels. And
it was 2005.
2005, yeah. And he said, "I'm not going to lose to this guy. He's 5'11", I'm 6'6", and if you watch the match, Shawn Michaels is overselling everything to where he's making looking like Hulk Hogan shooting him like right in the middle of the ring. And that was the sort of attitude that I think brought a lot of locker rooms down. Whereas a guy like Stone Cold or The Rock were very friendly around the locker room and I remember Perry Saturn saying he didn't even know my name. He called me Perry Satellite. You know, Hogan was very dismissive.
But you got also remember too, you got to think of when Steve Austin became the shit and became this big thing. It was only for a small period of time. So you remember the little guy. Hulk Hogan was sitting on top of the wrestling world since '84. You know what I mean? So yeah, who the fuck am I going to lose to a 5'6" Perry Saturn tattooed fucker who's never won anything in his life, never sold anything in his life? Why would I lose to that guy?
You didn't have to call Perry Satellite.
Yeah. But I mean, you talk about Shawn Michaels. This is also in 2005, which is at the very end of Hogan's career, which I'm sure he was trying to look for that iconic moment to go out on. You know, maybe he should have gone out on that loss to The Rock in 2002, WrestleMania 18, which was just one of those matches, like I mentioned before. It could have been, one of the greatest ever. You know, maybe he should have gone out in that one, but I think he held on for too long, maybe. And he was like, he does have a point. He's got the same status, I think, at a certain point as Andre the Giant. You're going to really lose to a 5'9" dude. It doesn't make sense when you look at the big picture.
Randy, can I ask you a question?
Go ahead.
Being that, Bob mentioned the match with The Rock, and so I picked Stone Cold, and Bob mentioned it at the time. Stone Cold was already on his way out due to injury and other things like that. Yeah. Imagine if that shit didn't happen, and it was not The Rock fighting Hulk Hogan. It was Stone Cold, who's still not injured, who's still reigning supreme. How do you think that would have been? Do you think it would have had the same iconic?
I think so.
Status that Bob says that match had.
I would put The Rock and Stone Cold on par with each other. I think they're very fortunate to be there at the same time. Those guys are 1 and 1A when it comes to the Attitude Era. I think it would have been impactful. I think it would have been amazing. You think it
would have been bigger or just as big?
Just as big.
Just curious.
Just as big. Yeah, just as big. I think so. And I think The Rock added a lot to it just because we knew he was still at his apex, but we also knew he was bound for bigger things. But I think Stone Cold would have been equally as an amazing match. Maybe not in ring technician wise, but the electricity and the excitement, I think, would have been palpable. It would have been maintained. Let me ask you guys this before we wrap up. Your Mount Rushmore of wrestlers. I'm going to give you mine because all three of ours are on there. To me, it's Ric Flair, Hogan, Stone Cold, and The Rock. I think that's my Mount Rushmore. What would you guys say is your Mount Rushmore?
You know what? I kind of maybe have to agree with that. I think I would have to say, because The Rock, Stone Cold, definitely. Hulk, sure. I understand the longevity of the career and the iconicness of the character. It's really tough for me to I don't know, man. I think Shawn Michaels had a great career. Unfortunately, there was some demons along the way. Shawn Michaels' career and he put on some hell. I could kind of put him up there with Flair.
The greatest in-ring wrestler, I think, is Shawn Michaels.
So I mean, I would do that. I would pick Shawn Michaels instead of Flair.
I completely disagree about The Rock. He, yes, he was great on the mic, and he had such a small body of work, again, just like Stone Cold. And yeah, he wanted to be this actor and this and that. You can't put him ahead of somebody like Shawn Michaels, of somebody like The Undertaker. There's no fucking way in hell. I could say, if there's a Mount Rushmore, it's Hogan, it's Flair, it's The Undertaker, and it's Steve Austin. If you wanted it to flop out or switch out, maybe Shawn Michaels or Bret Hart in there instead. I could say, switching out maybe with The Undertaker, maybe with Steve Austin. But I just don't feel like you could put The Rock in there. I don't feel like he qualifies. It's just such a smaller body of work. You know what I mean?
One more thing before we go. Maybe we should poll our listeners. We'll put it up on Twitter or Instagram or something. who's finished, because we didn't really talk about the finishing moves, and we're not gonna do that now because then we'll fucking be here for another 2 hours.
But Zoom will freeze on us. It'll go tad chilly on us.
But we got to talk about the finishers. Who had the most I guess powerful or most thrilling or most like, oh, that looked like that shit hurt.
You talking about between our three,
the stunner, the leg drop, and the figure four. And let me tell you, I've put somebody in the figure four before, whether it's real or not. That shit hurts, and I've been in the figure four. It fucking hurts. But I can only imagine dropping somebody's neck on my shoulder, just flat down, and whether and how much that's going to hurt.
Hit their knees. They hit your knees.
You're supposed to hit your knees.
How about a size 15 boot in the face?
If they sell it, it looks good. But a boot to the I'm laying down. Oh, somebody hit me on the face with their boot.
Okay, well, Anderson Silva's knocked out people with a boot to the face. Sir. I'm just
none of these moves are the best. I think. I think both of them involve sitting on your ass, doing the leg drop, and doing the Stone Cold Stunner. And I can't say Stone Cold Stunner because DDP did the Diamond Cutter.
It's a sharpshooter.
Randy Orton does the RKO, and they do a better version than what Stone Cold does with a stunner. The figure four, it's okay, but so many people have used it. What I love about the figure four is every time they reversed it on Flair and he screamed in pain like he was being tortured in a hostile movie. That's the only reason why I go with the figure four, not because he was my selection, but the anticipation of the submission was always nice to watch.
We'll put it up there for the listeners and for the fans.
Yeah. All right, guys. So thank you all so much for joining us today. That is our show. Listeners, we'd like to hear from you. Who is your favorite wrestler of all time? Who's the best wrestler of all time? Well, who did we not mention? I could think of one person I wish I had mentioned. Kurt Angle. Shout outs to him because he was.
I know, dude. I thought about that earlier, and I'm sorry.
Kurt Angle was tremendous. So let us know what you think. Please follow us on Formidable Opponents on Twitter, Opponents. On Instagram, formidable_opponents. You can email us at formidableopponents@gmail.com. Next week, we will be arguing what is the funniest all-time movie scene. That's going to be a great one. It's going to be our 10th show. So for Bob and Joseph, thank you all so much for joining us tonight. For the fellas, I'll see you guys later. I was trying to think of a funny wrestling outro, but I couldn't. So I'm just going to end it with this.
It's still real to me, damn it.
There you go. There you go. Somebody had to mention it.
Take it easy. Take it easy.
Yeah. So we'll see y'all next week for funniest movie scene. Take care, all.
Oh, yeah.